Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Scrubbing the Skies, the webinar series of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal at American University. The Institute is a research group at American University that focuses on helping to define and help operationalize the contours of responsible carbon removal globally. Uh, One issue that we have addressed a number of times and will continue to revisit is the question of how to scale carbon removal responsibly, but also robustly, so that carbon removal is fit for purpose in terms of helping us to meet the obligations that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has established for carbon removal in terms of 2050 as well as 2100. And one of the things that we all know in this community all too well is that it is likely that the voluntary carbon markets alone are not fit for purpose in terms of generating the kind of demand that will be required for that kind of scaling, and to ensure that prices begin to drop to help to stimulate more demand. And so a burning issue in our community is how to robustly and yet responsibly integrate carbon removal into compliance markets, right? And we've seen one instance of this very recently with the decision at COP29 to operationalize Article 6.4, which provides a route for voluntary but compliance-based market trading of carbon removal emissions, as well as Article 6.2, which could facilitate this. Another avenue for integration into compliance markets is in emissions trading systems. And the largest and longest established of these emissions trading systems is the European Union's emissions trading system. And there's been increasing discussion within the EU of integrating carbon removal into that system, and timeframes and contours for how this would be done. Today, we're going to look at a recent report that seeks to focus on that issue, entitled "Voluntary to Compliance Markets: Integrating Carbon Removal into the EU ETS." And this is a report that was jointly prepared by the Clean Air Task Force and CONCITO, which is a climate think tank. And we're fortunate enough to have two of the authors of that report with us today to discuss how to achieve that fine balance of integrating large amounts of carbon removal into the European Union emissions trading system, but also doing it in a way that does not interfere with the overarching objectives of the treaty, as well as to ensure that notions of sustainability and equity and justice are infused into this proposal. So our two guests today are Cody Rossi, who is the Europe Policy Manager for Carbon Capture at the Clean Air Task Force. Welcome, Cody. As well as Johannes Gamelgold Butcher, who is the climate analyst for CONCITO. As is true with most of our webinars, we will begin with an initial intervention by both of our speakers for approximately 25 minutes. I'll then try to seed the conversation with a couple of initial questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. So I encourage you throughout the initial presentation to begin propagating your questions, and we will get to as many of them as we can. And with that, I will turn it over to Cody to begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, Will, and hello, everyone. Good evening here from Europe, and good afternoon or good morning to wherever you may be. I'm going to share some slides here that we presented first in Brussels in December, where we presented our report, as well as some other slides I prepared just for today to kind of set the foundation. But thank you so much for having us, Will, and we're really looking forward to digging deep into this issue because it doesn't just apply to Europe. It also applies to any other countries which may be thinking about compliance markets. But when we start to talk about this issue of integrating carbon removals into compliance markets, it's probably good to start from the beginning, right? Like, what is a compliance market to start? And in Europe, the way we have ours set up is a cap and trade system. And this picture here, which I found today, is quite a good representation, I feel, of what a compliance market is, at least in the EU ETS. Here you've got two kind of emitting installations, say emitter A and emitter B, which are both covered by this cap and trade system. The cap is a cap on the total amount of emissions that can be emitted, and that goes down over time. The trade part of that is where emitter B has reduced its GHG emissions and is able then to kind of sell additional permits to emitter A, which has excess GHG emissions. So what this does is it helps to kind of incentivize emitters to find the cheapest ways of reducing their emissions and rewards those that are actually doing it. So this kind of picture that we see here is a good example because it is kind of what we have going in the EU. It's important to say that the compliance part of this is this legal obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So companies are either allocate or must purchase allowances or credits that correspond to the amount of emissions. In Europe, we have a reducing total amount of emissions or CAP, which reduces over time. And we can get a little bit more into that as the presentation continues, because it's kind of one of the reasons why the whole conversation around integrating carbon removals into the system is really happening. Around 19% of global greenhouse gas emissions are actually covered by emissions trading systems. That's the latest data from the World Bank. That's up from 17% in 2020. So we're starting to see these systems get expanded more and more. In terms of where carbon removals are already integrated into carbon compliance markets, we're really at the start of this. So some emissions trading schemes have already some integration of carbon removals. And when I say carbon removals, I mean mostly temporary removals such as afforestation or reforestation projects. Most compliance markets don't have experience working with, say, direct air capture or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, so permanent removals like that. One example of a emissions trading system which has integrated carbon removals, which we do actually dive a little bit into in the report as a kind of an example of what not to do, but is New Zealand's ETS. And New Zealand's ETS allows an unlimited amount of forestry credits to enter the system, and also has this kind of parity between a ton of emissions reductions and a ton of carbon that's removed through afforestation or reforestation. And what we found by digging into the experience of that emissions trading system is that it really depressed the price. And that's because there's an unlimited amount of those credits that can go in. There's also a whole other set of issues which, we'll touch upon as we talk about integrating removals into the EU ETS. Some other examples, a US example, for example, is California's cap and trade program. There are certain Chinese pilot ETS which are in certain regions, and a Korean ETS as well. Now, the thing about all of these is they all have quantitative limits and qualitative criteria for using those offsets into the compliance system. Some news as well is that the United Kingdom are starting to consider this. So right now we have this kind of two tracks of policy deliberations ongoing. You have the United Kingdom, which has a separate emissions trading system to Europe since they left the EU. And they are also considering what they call greenhouse gas removals, which is just the kind of the same thing, except it also constitutes, say, methane removal. But they are also now considering it and have put out a consultation on this issue. The European Union is also looking into this as part of a review in 2026 of the EU ETS system. And then just last year, we had some news where Japan's ETS would be allowing international carbon removals into the system. That ETS is voluntary in this current phase, but does plan to move into a compliance market. And I think it does actually cover 60% of Japan's emissions, so it's already quite a large system. But, the too long didn't read of this. It really is that permanent carbon removals have not really been integrated at scale in any ETS so far. So really, we're breaking new ground here. But what is the EU ETS? Because I think it's important for us to kind of have a good, solid foundation before we move into some of the more technical parts of our report. On the right here, you can see the price of a carbon permit, what is termed in EU's emissions allowance, essentially the permission to permit 1 ton of carbon. And it's currently at around 78 euros, which is around $80 right now. That's coming up from kind of a peak of over 100 euro in 2023. But what we would expect is that this price will continue to rise as less and less emissions allowances are being allocated. So the EU ETS was founded in 2007, and as Will alluded to earlier, it is one of the largest of its kind worldwide. It covers around 40% of the EU's emissions, and it is really, arguably, but it is the most important lever shaping climate policy in the EU at the moment. It covers emissions from electricity and heat generation, industrial manufacturing and aviation, as well as just last year was extended to maritime transport as well. It operates in all EU countries plus Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, and is also linked to Switzerland's emissions trading system as well. It should also be noted that this is also expanding through a separate ETS to cover buildings and road transport as well. So these is only going to increase as time goes by. So, and with that, I think it's good to segue into our report, the Balancing Act, Risks and Benefits of Integrating Permanent Carbon Removals into EU ETS. And Johannes, do you want to take it away from here?
Yes, if you can just go to the next slide. The objective of our report was to then look at what happens when we try and integrate permanent carbon removals into the EU ETS, which the European Union already has to look at before the summer of 2026. The two main things that we are trying to look at if you integrate permanent carbon removals is one, the functioning and integrity of the EU ETS, and then secondly, also the short and long-term demand for permanent carbon removals. And I think, we also have that we are not in the report necessarily advocating for integrating permanent carbon removals into the ETS. We're also looking at what happens if permanent carbon removals are to be integrated. The policy options for incentivizing permanent carbon removals in the European Union can roughly be split into these 6 options, where the first 4 are the ones that we decided to include in our report because those are the ones which are more so directly related to the functioning of the EU ETS. So the first one is direct integration with no restrictions. So what happens if we just let permanent carbon removals come into the system and compete purely on price? The second one is a direct integration, but with a maintained emissions cap. So this means that for every ton of permanent carbon removals that come into the system, we then have to deduct an allowance from the next year's emissions cap. So it's a sort of one in, one out system. The third one is integration with supply controls. So this basically just means that we are controlling how much of each type of permanent carbon removal can come into the system in any given year. And then fourth, we have this intermediary institution, which could handle an integration of permanent carbon removals into the EU ETS by giving it a mandate to do so. And the report also looks primarily at DACs and bio-CCS, where bio-CCS includes CCS on biogas upgrading. It includes BECS and also CCS on waste-to-energy facilities. And we also included biochar, but that is only handled as a sensitivity analysis in the report. And the policy context for this in the EU is that we know that in 2050, we will undeniably still have a lot of residual emissions, and these residual emissions have to be offset either by our net LULUCF removals or by the permanent carbon removals that we're looking at in this report, which is DACs and bio-CCS. And this is also all in the context of a European emissions trading scheme, which is sort of running out of allowances as it is in the current directive. We decided to adjust this emissions cap a little bit for the sake of the analysis, but the overall sentiment is still true that we are running very low on allowances within the system. Yeah, and I think over to you now, Cody.
Yeah, thanks so much, Johannes. When we were conducting this analysis, we became very aware of this, as one of Johannes's colleagues termed it, the trilemma of trade-offs. And really what we were trying to find was some sort of solution or policy option that sits in the middle of this. But in reality, what we've found is that, every option is going to have a trade-off. So in terms of environmental integrity, that means the overall integrity of the EU ETS itself. And what we mean by that is that it has to be strong and robust in that 1 ton of permanent carbon removal is equal to 1 ton of emissions reduction. It also needs to ensure that the trajectory of the emissions reductions is sustained, and as well that market participants such as emitters are not taking any decisions such as like hedging their bets on carbon removals coming in later on in the system and then not doing emissions reductions today when they need it. We also need to think of the trade-off with cost effectiveness, because if we add in more layers of bureaucracy or of limits or regulations, that can limit the cost effectiveness and cost finding of the market participants. So if we allow all just removals into the system, then it's kind of up to the market participants to find what the most cost-effective option. But also the more kind of layers you add to it, the more administrative and fiscal impacts you add. For example, we have the intermediary institution, which would have the creation of a whole new institution, which would have to manage this system, right, and manage the integration. And as well as the way the ETS works in Europe is that a certain amount of the sales of these permits goes back to the countries themselves where the industries are for the use to decarbonize them. So if you are giving money to carbon removal suppliers, then you're also going to have impacts on those fiscal revenues in those countries. In terms of our main findings, so what we did find when we started running the modeling of the policy options, and again, we're looking at those 4 main ones that Johannes alluded to already, but what we found that was consistent throughout all of them is that really the cheapest removals are incentivized first. And this makes sense in a market, right? I mean, the market participants are always going to go for the cheapest option available for them to cover their emissions. And we found is that if you just directly integrate putting an unlimited amount of permanent carbon removals into the system, it would help create demand for the lower cost technologies. So putting CCS on biogas upgrading or the cheaper forms of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, the demand will be there for them. It's related to the price of the emissions allowances, but it would neglect the higher cost options such as direct air capture with carbon capture and storage, which is the other technology we included in this other than biochar. We found that there was going to be a risk of abatement deterrence without safeguards, and that integration itself does lower the incentives for emissions reductions. So without safeguards, companies could also emit more by substituting carbon removals for direct emissions reductions. We call that abatement deterrence because it's not emissions. You could say, it's still abatement that's happening, but it's just being done with carbon removals instead, which can be said to be undesirable substitution, but we can get into this a little bit later. One of the main risks we found is sustainability. So there's a certain amount of biomass, sustainably sourced biomass that is available in the EU at the moment. And what we have are all of these competing uses, from substitution and products to energy. Without safeguards, we would likely surpass the amount of sustainable biomass that is being used in the EU, because it'd be incentivized to take from the land sector and LULUCF to use it for carbon removals. We found that safeguards will in some instances negatively impact cost effectiveness and liquidity. And so that's that trade-off. There is no perfect solution when doing this. It will also, of course, affect the demand for certain types of carbon removals. We're talking here about, say, putting a limit on the amount of carbon removals that can enter the compliance market. And as well as any of these policy options will have fiscal implications because they'll affect EU ETS revenues. That's the money that comes from selling the allowances. We found that the intermediary institution, which has been termed many things in the literature, such as a carbon central bank, is probably the most common term you'll find. We kind of tried to find some way of formulating this institution to be as easily implementable as possible, given the current political reality in Europe and throughout the world, where unfortunately climate policies are starting to take a little bit of a backseat. But we did is we designed this in a way that it would procure and manage removals and their entry into the EU ETS. We found that it wasn't really necessary. There's a lot of things you could do with existing EU ETS legislation, and that the risk can be managed with safeguards. That's not to say that it's not a good idea, but its feasibility is very limited. And Johannes, do you want to talk through some of the modeling we have here?
Yes. So this might be a lot to handle just looking at it, but this is our modeling results for what happens when we try and model how an integration of permanent carbon removals without restrictions could look like in the EU ETS. And what we see here in purple is the number of allowances in the system for any given year under the emissions cap of the system. And then what we're seeing in two shades of light blue is these permanent carbon removals coming into the system. We are really only seeing biogas, CCS, and then BECCS coming in. And even when we look towards 2050, there simply isn't an economic incentive to actually do DACs and sell it into the system. But we do indeed see that these bio-based removals are coming into the system in quite large quantities, and in 2040 we will have a total of around 150 million tons of biogas, CCS, and BECCS coming into the system, which, due to some assumptions on biomass limitations, remain more or less constant towards 2050. And if we look at the next slide, we will see that we can also do this modeling exercise, but where we also include biochar. And since biochar is considerably cheaper than most of the biogas CCS and the BECCS, we will actually end up seeing that the biochar will crowd out biogas CCS and BECCS and basically take over half of the space for the biomass-based removals in the system. Again, we're seeing that it's around 150 million in total in 2040, but now 75 million of those are coming directly from biochar. What I think is important to mention, and this goes for both of the graphs, while an integration of permanent carbon removals will increase the amount of gross emissions within the system, so how many emissions the entities within the EU ETS are letting out to the atmosphere, we are also taking a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere with the BECCS, biogas CCS, and biochar, which means that the net emissions of the systems remain constant. Yeah.
Thanks, Johannes. So what can we recommend then for integrating into the compliance market? And, these questions obviously relate just to the EU ETS, but could be widely applicable, you could say, to some other compliance markets. We recommend maintaining the gross emissions cap. So that's maintaining that trajectory of removing allowances from the system. And we recommend that to prevent abatement deterrence and to preserve the core function of the EU ETS. We really want to stay strong as the main principal lever for driving emissions reductions in the European Union. We believe that should be technology-specific supply controls. So that means limiting the amount of removals that can come in from biomass-based carbon removals. That's because, as Johannes alluded to, we only have so much sustainable biomass, as well as the potential fiscal impacts of countries having to forego all of those allowance revenues. We believe that there should be rules on permanence as well as a differentiated allowance design. That's getting a little bit technical on the allowance design, but rules on permanence, I think, are quite important, that there really needs to be that equivalence of if you take fossil CO2 out of the ground, that if you are compensating for that, that it needs to be stored on geological timescales. And we have the acronym CRCF. That's the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, which is a first of a kind public certification framework for carbon removals, which is being developed here in the EU. We just note that there may need to be some adjustments to the methodologies there, but they're still being worked out through the expert group. We also believe that, it's important to review these policy actions as you do them. So, in a couple of years, assess how this integration is affecting the system. Is it working? What kind of removals? Is it stimulating? Is it having any negative effects? What changes need to be done to the design features? And for biochar, we really want to caution that, for one, due to its lower cost, as well as the impacts it may have in terms of biomass availability, that there needs to be a really careful analysis beforehand. And I believe, Johannes, you're taking this slide?
Yeah, and in addition to all these recommendations that we come with, we also have some suggestions for supporting policies which could support a better integration of permanent carbon removals into the ETS. The first of which is separate reduction and removal targets. This could, at least to some degree, mitigate the risks in terms of both abatement deterrence, but also possibly some of the unsustainable biomass use that we might see under an integration. The second one is additional EU funding, and here we are especially thinking of direct air capture, because in a lot of the scenarios that we analyzed, the price in the emissions trading scheme never really gets high enough to see any DACs coming into the system. So if we really want to incentivize direct air capture, we might need additional EU funding to make this happen. The third one, and I think a very important for our organization, is that we also need prioritization and stronger regulation on the competing use of biomass and biogenic CO2. I don't know if Cody maybe touched upon this a bit earlier, but essentially what we're seeing in the EU at the moment is that we lack pricing in the land sector, which means that the entities under the emissions trading scheme can, for example, take biomass from the land sector and utilize it for themselves, where they don't have to pay the same price. So essentially, there are skewed incentives in the union at the moment that leads to an overuse of biomass. And also, at last, if there are to be any interlinkages with an integration of permanent carbon removals into the ETS and the voluntary carbon credit market, we need to ensure that the carbon credits are still additional, and we really need accurate climate claims. We don't want to see there being any double claims made between the voluntary carbon credit market and the compliance market. Yeah, and I think to the last slide here, we also have a couple of things to say on the overall policy development of this, because in the beginning, we might suggest that we maintain the emissions cap, that we have supply controls, and we have strict rules on permanence. But as we see the integration happening and seeing what exactly is going on in the policy landscape, we might remove some of these safeguards and change some of the fundamental interactions between permanent carbon removals and the EU ETS. And at last, it's also very important to mention that the EU integration into the EU ETS will not get us to net negative by itself. We definitely need additional policies and measures to get the EU to a net negative society. And I think that's it for our presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Cody and Johannes. We'll now move on to the question and answer portion of the webinar. And I will start off with just a couple of brief questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. One thing I was interested in is there's a lot of emphasis in the report, and I think it's salutary on ensuring the sustainability of any potential use of biomass for BECCS, biochar, and so forth. I was curious, given the fact that there's extensive discussion in the report also on the potential role of direct air capture, if you had any concerns in Europe about the potential crowding out phenomenon associated with high use of potentially renewable energy to run direct air capture facilities and the implications it might have for electrifying everything, for example.
Yeah, I can maybe
I'll
take
turn
this
it over
one.
to either one of you.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah. From our modeling exercise, we don't have this concern because we're basically letting everything compete purely on price. So if the model sees that it's economically efficient to do direct air capture, it will do direct air capture instead of doing other mitigation measures. But what we might see in the real world is that there will be additional subsidies for direct air capture, or there will be obligations to buy credits based on direct air capture, which could create a huge price incentive to do DACs. And in that scenario, we might actually end up seeing that DACs takes so much renewable energy out of our electricity grids that it actively harms other forms of electrification. And this would be a very bad idea from a policy standpoint, because what we end up doing is just something that is way more expensive than directly electrifying, for example, a lot of processes in industry.
And I'll just add to that, if that's okay. And so we have this certification framework that's coming out. And one of the methodologies at the EU level is to cover and certify removals that are generated through direct air capture. And part of this methodology that's proposed is that to count your electricity or energy use as, say, zero carbon, that it needs to have this three-pillar approach. So it needs to be temporarily correlated and matched to renewable energy. So they want to have it so that that's matched on a monthly to then an hourly rate. or sorry, matching, and that's the same rules that you have in the US for clean hydrogen, for green hydrogen, and the same rules you have in the EU for hydrogen as well. But there are other pillars as well that they want to have in place. One is additionality. So they want to make sure that if the direct air capture facility is using renewable energy, that renewable energy is additional to the grid. It also has to be within the same grid locality. So that's excluding kind of like guarantees of origin and other kind of methods of that are used by, say, like data centers, for example. But what I think one interesting thing about this is that um, there are some challenges for sure around hourly matching. But as that kind of grows in time, and as we don't really have any direct air capture facilities in Europe at the moment, the worry really is in the near term, right? It's not in the near term. But as you go further on, you really need to make sure that these new projects are adding extra capacity to the grid. Otherwise, as Joanna said, you're kind of just making a very inefficient use of your energy.
All right, thank you for that. I want to apologize, by the way, if you can hear large amounts of noise in the background. At UC Berkeley today, and they're building a gigantic new computer data center, ironically enough, right in back of me. But anyway, one other question, then we'll move to audience questions. One of the things in the report is that you indicate that you're going to focus on carbon removals within the European Union due to concerns about the functioning of the EU ETS and environmental integrity otherwise. I know there's some concern, there's certainly concern in the United States that we won't have sufficient amounts of removals just from indigenous sources. And so there's a bit of a trade-off there, and I was curious on why you landed on this side in terms of those trade-offs.
Yeah, for sure. I can start and on this. In terms of this initial phase, which is really where we are focusing on, we don't want to say that we have a crystal ball and be able to, foretell the future of the ETS in 2040. But at this early stage, we would really like to see if we are going to put direct air capture into the system, for example, so that this incentivizes a European base. Because one thing that we don't have in Europe right now is carbon removal subsidies, you could say, or the same sort of policies which are building these DAC hubs in America. We have one direct air capture facility under development near Paris in France, and that is very new. Otherwise, in Iceland, but that's not part of the European Union, and then we have some big specs projects. So really, we're trying to suggest that if this happens, we should really just be having domestic credits as well. It also simplifies things a little bit, right? Because if you're opening that up to, let's say, geologically stored DAC credits in the US, how do you ensure then that the storage permits and all of those regulations are, match EU regulations, for example? And if you're opening it further afield from the US, how do you make sure you have that same tightness of rules in other countries, which maybe don't have the same amount of experience? It's not to say that we forego that in the future completely. It might be an option to do that, say, with neighboring countries in Morocco, where they have abundance of like renewable energy. But again, just for this, like, I think starting phase, we need to be kind of small is the way to say it, I think.
All right. Thanks for that, Cody. Okay, I'm going to move to some audience questions. First one is for Cody, but feel free, Johannes, to add to this if you wish. Cody, is it not contradictory to note that compliance markets are intended to incentivize, quote, cheapest ways, and then to criticize the New Zealand system for depressing prices?
Yeah, that's a good question. Or a good point, rather. But yeah, so the cheap, I think it's a question of quality, right? So is it the right thing to do because it's the cheapest option? So in New Zealand, it's also by way of how you design the system, right? We are compliance markets at the end of the day are human constructions. They only work because we set them up in a certain way. What happened in New Zealand is that they integrated an unlimited amount or allowed an unlimited amount of forestry credits. So you have this system which is set up by us to work a certain way, and then you break it essentially. So the price is depressed, not because the price can be depressed and you could use a tree to reduce for every emission, but then we'd run out of space to plant trees. We would, and the carbon would not be locked away permanently, or at least would be at high risk to reversal. So it's not as simple as saying that that's the cheapest option. It's not really equivalent, which is why we only looked at permanent carbon removals in this report, if that answers your question.
Okay. Anything to add, Johannes?
No, not really. No.
All right. Okay. Next question from John Hoffmeyer. Is biochar incorporated into soils or infrastructure such as asphalt or concrete regarded as permanent or temporary carbon removal?
So in the analysis that we did, we looked at biochar as being a part of the agricultural system, so being spread on soils. This is also very important for the economics of biochar because farmers do gain a lot of value from being able to spread biochar on their fields. With regards to biochar being rather either permanent or temporary removal, I think it's an ongoing debate in the EU at the moment. There is a lot of cutting-edge research at the moment that suggests that a fraction of biochar, a set fraction of biochar, will never degrade. So it is, practically speaking, permanent, but it's not necessarily that it's the whole part of the biochar that is permanent, but some of it might be. But this is also something that I know Cody works a lot with in the CRCF regulation. I don't know if you want to add a comment to it.
I think you've summed it up quite well. Obviously, if you put it in concrete, it depends upon the disposal of the concrete, whether or not, what's going to happen to that, and the end of life of that product. And on the new research, I think what, at least from Clean Air Task Force side, we've been calling for is just more field data, really, before we start issuing credits, or especially before we start integrating it into compliance markets. We really need to be sure of how that fraction of the biochar, which is known as inertianite, functions in the soil after a long period of time. We know what it's like in certain soils up to 5, 10 years, 15 years, but we don't know about how it interacts with all soil types. So yeah, I think that the question is still out there, but it's certainly a promising carbon removal method.
Yeah, it's is that issue being looked at a granular level in the on the government side, the in terms of the CRCF standards?
Yeah, so what we have with the CRCF is there is an expert group which is consisted of professionals in the carbon removal space, whether they be technical providers, academics, or NGOs, such as ourselves, and we've met around 5 times so far. We're meeting again in another few months, and this topic has definitely come up a lot, and sometimes it has dominated the discussions.
Okay.
It's a bit simpler to do direct air capture in a way, because and actually I have to just say that the direct air capture companies have done a great job on their methodologies already. So there's a lot of good work to be done there as well. But as we kind of go forward into, say, enhanced rock weathering or an ocean alkalinity, that's when things get a little trickier because there's more disparity and variance in the established protocols that are already out there.
It's good. It's you're going to be a real test case, I think, in some ways, in terms of the establishment of these standards on the government side. So it'll be interesting for us to watch on this side of the pond too. Okay, next question from Jason Grillo. When you talk about additionality, can you elaborate on that? He said the term might mean different things to different people, right? And we know it does, right? So, how do you conceive of additionality in the context of integration? Either
Yeah.
one of you.
Okay, sure. So I suppose if we're thinking about additionality, we're thinking of primarily the voluntary carbon market, because within the compliance system itself, nothing is really addition. There's no real additionality box to tick, so to speak. When we talk about additionality in the compliance market and with the voluntary carbon market, is that, like, say if you're a direct air capture facility, and the EU wants to get a certain amount of direct air capture into the compliance market, or have that capacity as the EU has modeled that we need it, then that certain amount of voluntary funding is additional, because the carbon removal project wouldn't have happened without it. Because once you start mandating things, that's when things get a little bit complicated. Like, say you start mandating that a certain amount of direct air capture has to be developed, or that a company has to use a certain amount of direct air capture credits. Then voluntary carbon market funding, is it really additional? Shouldn't the company not be fully paying for that service itself? These are the kind of sticky questions we get into there. On additionality, when it comes to like power, electricity generation, I think that's more straightforward when you're thinking about direct air capture. It's just that you're adding extra grid capacity. You're adding more. You're allowing for more renewable energy capacity onto the grid than would have happened in the case that your project didn't come on board. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Johannes.
Yeah, I just maybe want to mention very explicitly that if we integrate a permanent carbon removal into the EU ETS, then the additionality of that credit will be considerably lowered or called into question if it's sold on the voluntary carbon market as well. So it's just to say that you might have a facility that generates some credits that today sell them on the voluntary carbon credit market, but that if they also want to sell it to the entities under the EU ETS, then probably there isn't a lot of additionality left in their credits. Yeah.
All right. Next question, anonymous attendee. How much does your analysis of environmental sustainability take into account the social impacts of these carbon market mechanisms? How do social impacts play out in these mechanisms?
So the social side of integrating permanent carbon removals into the EU ETS is not something that we explicitly talk a lot about throughout the report, and it's not something that we are really trying to assess. But we do know from experience that the social side of things do indeed matter quite a lot. For example, people do care whether they are being included in processes regarding, for example, geological storage under where their houses are. I think for the social acceptance of these solutions, it's very important that citizens are indeed included in these processes, but especially, particularly in relation to our report, we didn't really look too much into this.
Okay. Anything to add, Cody?
No, I think that's it's on the nose. Like, in the EU, we've got a number of other policies aiming to kind of hit the social targets as well. But within the emissions trading system itself, it really doesn't consider any of these kind of other impacts rather than just the emissions and the cap and the price. So we tried to kind of keep our analysis grounded in those things. Although, of course, social issues are really important when we're talking about the impacts on communities.
Yeah, and how do they? I'm just curious. Given the fact that you do have those parallel social targets in the EU, how does that interface with the EU TS, or does it not at all in terms of what's acceptable in the market?
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, industry employs thousands and thousands of people in the EU, and those are the installations which are covered by the emissions trading system. So when the price goes up, the carbon price, especially when you start looking at there's less and less emissions allowances in the system, that's when you start getting into, a little bit of a tricky situation with the emissions price where it could be uncompetitive to remain, say, in Europe under that emissions trading system, which is why it's talked about as a potential solution, one of a few solutions put out there to have carbon removals available in the system to handle those last emissions, right? Because otherwise those industries are employing those people are going to be, facing a very high carbon price. So in terms of, I think the social considerations, that's the main nexus that is hit here in Europe. We don't have to the same degree the environmental justice concerns from heavy industry. It's very localized. That is, of course, an issue, but in some regions, but I don't think it is as front and center as it is in the US.
All right. Next question from Duncan McLaren. Can you elaborate on why you conclude that an intermediary model is not needed as opposed to politically challenging but preferable?
Mm-hmm. So from our side, from Clean Air Task Force side, I think um, when we looked into this, we decided to I should just preface this by saying that we decided to look at it very narrowly, okay? Because when we started digging into this intermediary institution and in the literature, the mandate and the roles and options that this institution could do are endless. It could procure carbon removals. It could manage the compliance markets cap. It could manage liability. It could translate removals into allowances. It could apply buffers and controls, and then it could even take charge of all climate policy and not, insulate climate policy in the EU from elections, for example, or political kind of changes. So we decided to look at not necessary means it's not necessary to conduct the integration. You could conduct the integration through amendments to existing EU law and the current system, but not preferable. And I think this is just a personal preference of mine. I would like to see some sort of institution put in place, at least to procure carbon removals in the EU. But it is challenging in Europe right now because we have this pushback against climate policies, which is not just in the US. We also have that here. We have government parties which are starting to gain ground in elections, which are completely dismissive of climate policy, let alone spending millions of euros on sucking carbon out of the sky.
Yeah, yeah, that's an important point, and I suspect a couple more within the next few months. So it's interesting. Okay, next a question. This will combine a couple of questions, but there were some queries about enhanced rock weathering and marine carbon dioxide removal, right? Which I know in the report you indicate that you don't cover because of the early stage development. The challenge from somebody was, do you consider these pathways to be a dead end and thus not worthy of consideration?
Maybe I can try and answer this. I think the main problem when it comes to marine CDR and also enhanced rock weathering is that we have really bad MRV on this. So we have really bad monitoring, reporting, and verification of what actually happens when we do these CDR methods. How much CO2 are we actually capturing and storing? And if we don't really have a good handle on how much is actually captured and stored, then it also probably wouldn't be the best idea to try and integrate it into a compliance market like the EU ETS, which is known for really being good at monitoring, reporting, and verifying emissions. This is not to say that enhanced rock weathering and marine CDR is a dead end as technologies or that it shouldn't be considered at the European level at all. The only thing that we're saying at the moment is that it probably isn't fit for purpose within the scope of the ETS, but it's definitely something that maybe should be considered in broader subsidy pools.
Okay. Anything to add on that, Cody? Okay. All right. Next question from Alex Hanafi. Can you say how you modeled the supply and sourcing of the removal allowances you modeled, and particular whether you used only domestic EU sources or modeling based on potential global supply?
So the way that we modeled the supply of permanent carbon removals can kind of be split into all of the separate technologies which we considered. So for biogas CCS for BECS, what we end up trying to find in the academic literature is, first of all, what is the prices of these technologies? And then secondly, how much of these technologies can be deployed within the EU. And when we have these two estimates, we can put them together, and then we have a sort of supply curve of how much of the permanent carbon removals within the EU. We are only considering domestic sources. So especially when it comes to the bio-based removals, we are only considering biomass being used within the EU. So we're really not looking at the global supply in that regard.
All right. Next question. Considering the need to reduce emissions globally from the land sector, can you say more about why you chose not to model removals reduction synergies in the land sector?
While I think it would actually be really great if we did that, I don't think within the scope of both the resources and the time we had within the project that we actually could have done this. Because trying to model the interactions between permanent carbon removals, the EU ETS, and the land sector would have been a very, very complicated exercise. So while it is really important that we do consider the land sector, which is also something we point to throughout the report, we do need better incentives in the land sector, we do need better pricing in the land sector, and we do need to make sure that biochar, biogas CCS, and BECS don't abuse the lack of pricing in the land sector. It's not something that we were able to model in this report.
Okay. All right. Next question from Anna Littlefield. With these expansive compliance markets, how do you ensure or measure credit quality and compare credits that are generated through different methods with varying permanence, measurability, and so forth?
Sure, I can come in on that, and just want to say thank you for all these great questions. It's been really good. On that, we look to the carbon removal certification framework, or rather, I should be saying the new name, the carbon removal and carbon farming certification framework. So each of these methodologies at the EU level have looked at what is being done in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification in the voluntary carbon market and try and look at best practices. So for each of these methods, you have a set quantification of the net carbon removal benefit. Now, here is kind of one of the sticky issues with integrating carbon removals into the emissions trading system. The emissions trading system, as Joanna said, is very good on MRV. If there's a ton emitted, there's a ton emitted, and you can be sure of that. When we are adding in uncertainty when it comes to carbon removals, even with a direct air capture facility, there is an uncertain amount of CO2 that may be lost from the capture to the transport to the ultimate storage. Small amounts, small percentages, but there is uncertainty there. When we have different technologies such as enhanced rock weathering, that uncertainty is multiplied, and it also very much depends on whether or not you're doing soil sampling, how long you're doing it, and by what means and assumptions you use. So really having a really rigorous set of methodologies is really important, and that's something that we're working on very hard to try and make sure, because if you don't have trust in these methodologies and credits, then you're not going to have trust in the ETS if they end up in there at the end of the day.
Okay. So we're almost at our concluding time. I was wondering if you had any additional remarks or thoughts about other things that need to be researched or other questions moving forward.
Yeah, just I suppose one final thought here in Europe is that we can see that we need a lot of carbon removals. The EU did some modeling, and those residual emissions uh, are optimistic. We are unfortunately missing climate targets left and right across the world. So we need to scale up carbon removals quickly, but we need to make sure that when we're doing that, we're not like messing with any other systems, such as the emissions trading system, and damaging that system, right? So just to say that, we really need to be throwing more resources to develop all of these other carbon removal technologies that are already mentioned, even if they are not, say, fit for purpose to put into a compliance market right now.
Mhm. Yeah, right. And easier said than done, though, at a time when governments are hostile to funding, right? Procurement and things of that nature. But okay. Anything else, Johannes, from your end?
Yeah, I just quickly want to mention that from a policy standpoint, I think it's still very important that we try and explore what might be the best option for incentivizing permanent carbon removals in the long run. Because while the EU ETS might do a great job in the near/medium future, we don't really see it working in the really long term. So I think we need our best brains to really start thinking about how do we create long-term sustainable demand for permanent carbon removals.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Unless the EU ETS gets extended and mandates negative emissions, right, at some point, which I guess is possible, but it's an interesting question. So, okay, we have reached the top of the clock once again. I would like to thank our guests, Cody and Johannes, for a very interesting sort of discussion. And hopefully, I got to most of the questions. It was a very, very live bench today. So thank you very much to our audience for their thoughtful interventions. Also, I just want to put in a plug. It's a rare time we're having back-to-back webinars this week, and we have one tomorrow that, in the words of Monty Python, is something completely different. We're going to focus on atmospheric methane removal instead of carbon removal. It has some interesting parallels and some potential synergisms with carbon removal. So even if it's not your bag, I encourage you to think about joining us. I also think members of the methane removal community can greatly benefit from our experiences to date in the carbon removal community as they seek to move forward and address the second really largest forcer in terms of climate change. So I hope a lot of you can join us, and registration in advance is required. So once again, thanks everyone, and we will see you next time. Goodbye now.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.